What's happening in the negotiations is pretty confusing and quite a poor process. So what happened today was that finally at around 6 o'clock in the morning, the long-term cooperative action, the LCA track, finished their plenary. And they finished it with an agreement after 2 years of negotiations, which was hardly to be called an agreement at all. Algeria, I think, put it, I'm not quite sure what we're agreeing, we're not actually agreeing to anything. So, you know, the negotiators didn't get far. And I think it's important to understand that the fault is not in the negotiators. And, you know, there's a lot of people who kind of get down on the negotiators, what they've been doing for the last 2 years, but actually they didn't get the political mandate to be able to negotiate. In order to be able to negotiate, they have to have the kind of political framework within which to negotiate, the parameters. So it's quite tragic for these people who have spent 2 years of their lives in these negotiations that they have got virtually nowhere. There are a few things in there that are important in the text. The negotiating draft has gone towards the right direction in some things, and particularly it's gone towards some right directions on finance. There are some pieces of the finance package that are important. So they're setting up a new mechanism, a new fund for finance, and lots of us who don't want the World Bank and the GEF and the funding stream are very pleased that something, the adaptation fund that's set up under the Kyoto Protocol or something like that will become the new funding mechanism, because that allows for better governance, transparent governance, etc. So there are some things like that are progress. There's a bit of progress on bunker fuels, levies on bunker fuels, i.e. aviation and shipping, what they've been trying to do is to get wording in there that ensures that the industry doesn't self-regulate itself, but actually has some finance coming back to fund adaptation and mitigation for climate change. So there are some things like that on finance that are worth saving, but all of the big stuff is kicked up to ministers. Now, you know, if big issues are kicked up to ministers and there are kind of 4 or 5 of them, they might be able to make progress. But literally there's hundreds of issues that have been kicked up to ministers, and it's going to be very difficult for them to sort out. So then the high-level meeting started. And the first thing that happened was that the Danish presidency announced that Connie Hedegaard, the Danish minister, was being replaced by Rasmussen, the Prime Minister. Now that immediately sent sort of alarm bells in many developing countries, because they were concerned about what the Prime Minister had previously done to kind of slip in a draft document. And if those of you remember the beginning of last week, when the Danish Prime Minister was working on a document that looked suspiciously like the United States position, but which was actually a draft of the presidency document, that was met with a pretty angry reaction from developing countries. So now the Prime Minister has taken over as chair of the negotiations, replacing Connie Hedegaard, who people trusted much more. So the first thing that happened in the high-level segment is that developing countries said, we do not accept a text coming from the Danish presidency. And that's a really important point, because what would happen is that the Danish presidency would put down a text which the developing countries, and I think many of us, would regard as a bad fudge and not necessarily the interest of a fair, ambitious and binding deal from Copenhagen. So the developing countries hung tough. They refused to accept the text, and the situation is remaining a bit confused. And the last we heard before I came to walk here was that the Danish presidency would not be introducing a text. So that's kind of important. And the downside is that they're going to have to try and negotiate from that mess of a text that comes from the officials. So that's the status. With 2 days to go, it is a real shambles. And I think we can all be deeply, deeply worried about where these negotiations are heading and what is likely to come out of it. And I would say one thing that's likely to come out of it is that the odds of a collapse suddenly got a little higher today.